Every week, then you will know that Andy Lashley has thrown our church into a massive debate about candy corn. And so I wanted to settle this debate publicly for a moment with two simple questions. I need to know in a moment how many of you actually like candy corn, and then I need to know how many of you passionately hate candy corn. So quick show of hands here is very important. How many of you would say, you know what, you like candy corn? See, it baffles me. I just assumed there wouldn't be many people. What is wrong with you? It's just sugar. Like there's nothing to it. Thank you. Is that Andy? That sounded like Andy. Or is that Brent? Brent, how many of you are true Christians and passionately hate candy corn? Good. We're outnumbered. Man, I've been shocked. I was so wrong as to what I thought that would be. So I'm just going to move on. This is week 4 of a series I'm calling Digital Health, how you bring theology to your technology. Next week's the final lesson in this series, and so next week I'm going to challenge the church to do something we're calling digital detox. There should be a slide for that, and the idea here is what can you disconnect from next week in order to reconnect with things that matter, things like God, things like family. So 1 week from today, I'm going to challenge you to do something for 1 week. That might be giving up TV for a week, that might be giving up Facebook for a week, maybe Twitter, something. Maybe you create healthier boundaries with your phone for a week, but I want you to think about what's one thing you can do starting a week from today to have a better relationship with your technology. Well, in this series, I've introduced you to a lot of world-renowned researchers. Introduced you to a lady named Mary Aiken earlier this year. She wrote a really big book called The Cyber Effect. Introduced you to a woman named Gloria Mark. She pioneered a new field of research called interruption science. I've introduced you to a guy named Tim Challies, who's a great Christian thinker who bridges the gap between faith and technology. And so I want to introduce you to one more brilliant researcher. His name is Dr. Mickey Bannister. He happens to be an elder at this church. And recently, he did his own little survey that I want to read you about. Every morning, he walks over on the campus of Oklahoma Christian next door. And so he sent me this email, and he said I could read it to you. And here's some of Dr. Bannister's research. He said, the last week of September, I started tracking the number of responses I received from people I passed and spoke to each morning. So he walks, and he's just saying hello to everybody, and he's tracking how many people say something back. Then he says, I realized that I might be a little bit frightening, being a large man with a beard and a terrifying 11-pound dog on a leash, which is a great mental image. But I would simply say good morning to everybody as we walked by, and I kept track of their responses. Unfortunately, less than 20% of people spoke back to me and returned the greeting. Most had earbuds attached to their heads, their faces were down, they were engrossed in their electronic devices. I do admit that my dog attracted favorable attention. He added that at the end. So the side effect that I want to throw out to you this week is that one thing that technology can do is technology can make us really cold-hearted. Not cold as in temperature, but it does change the way we interact with our world, as Dr. Bannister's research shows us. There's 2 ways I want to talk about this today. The second way is actually what I want to spend the majority of the sermon on, but I do want to mention something at the very beginning. Maybe you can just think about this later today or this week. One of the ways that technology makes us cold-hearted is it makes us cold-hearted towards the outside world. So media has this sense in which it desensitizes us to things going on in the outside world. Nielsen Research Company, they do a lot of research, and I read this the other day. Elementary school kids will see 8,000 murders by the time they reach middle school. And then teenagers, by the time that they graduate high school, will have witnessed 200,000 acts of violence online or in the movies that they watch. And so this does have an effect. There's research which shows this does have an effect on the way in which we engage with the world. We are desensitized towards suffering, towards violence, simply because we see it so often on our screens. In fact, the University of Michigan did an interesting study where they had two groups of people. One group of people they let watch neutral media, and then the second group of people they had watch violent media. And then after each group watches the neutral media or the violent media, they would stage a fight between two actors, and at the end of this fight, it ended with a woman on the ground pretending that her ankle was hurt. And so they measured the response time of each group. And it was interesting because the group that had watched neutral media, they responded 16 seconds after the woman went down with the hurt ankle. And the group that had watched the violent media, it took them 73 seconds on average to respond to this hurting woman. And so again, their conclusion is that the more we consume media, especially violent media, the more our compassion decreases. Others call this compassion fatigue. And it happens all the time. In fact, this is where it might affect your world more often. When you get online and just start clicking through things, I mean, isn't it amazing what your brain takes in the course of a few minutes? Just this morning, I got online. First thing I clicked on was massive earthquake strikes Italy. Second thing I clicked on was big political scandal in South Korea. Third thing I clicked on, huge plane crash. Fourth thing I clicked on, a big murder. So I take all that in my brain in about 2 minutes. So over time, what that does is it desensitizes us to suffering in the world. So it's important to note one side effect of technology is it does make us cold-hearted towards suffering and towards our world. Now here's the second piece to this cold-hearted thing I'm trying to tell you about today. So the second way that technology makes us cold-hearted is that it makes us cold-hearted within the words that we use. In fact, you actually become a different person behind a screen than you do when you're face-to-face with somebody. Maybe you've had this experience where you sit down to your computer, or maybe it's your phone, and you start typing an email or you start typing out a text message, and you type it up and you reread it and you think, this might not be the best thing to send. Maybe it's a little offensive. Maybe you find there's a line or two that the person might misinterpret, but you're just tired and you don't really want to edit it. And so you look at that send button and you think, I could just hit send. That'd be a lot easier. And so you do it. You just go ahead and you hit the send button, sending this message that you probably wouldn't have said that if it was face to face. You become a different person online. Just think about politics. This past year, what has been the number one story concerning Hillary Clinton? Her what? Her email. And then what's been one of the top 5 things concerning Donald Trump? It's Twitter. It's what he tweets. So Hillary made some decisions behind a screen that we're hoping she wouldn't make in person. And Donald Trump makes these decisions when he's tweeting that he probably would make those face-to-face. But we become different people. We become different people when we get behind our screens. And so there's some people a lot more brilliant than me that are substantiating this idea. So one is someone I've talked about before in this series, this lady named Mary Aiken. And in her book, her big book, The Cyber Effect, she simply makes the conclusion that the more time that you spend online, the more cruel that you actually become. Now, a different lady, her name is Sherry Turkle. She's an MIT professor, and she helps explain why exactly this happens. So a middle school in upstate New York contacted Dr. Turkle because the administration was very concerned at the way that the students were behaving. Now, most middle school students are fairly mean and cruel to each other, but for whatever reason, this particular middle school in New York, things were getting out of hand. Kids were saying awful things to each other all day long. The teachers felt it. The principal felt it. They didn't know what to do. So they asked Dr. Turkle to drive up and investigate what was going on. So she did. She went up there and spent several weeks trying to figure out what it was that was causing so much cruelty in this middle school. And at the end of her study, what she concluded was that technology, it was actually eroding empathy. Technology takes away something that you have built into your body, which is empathy. And so she wrote a book about it, and in her book she explained it this way. In her book, she says, so when you're with somebody and you say something face to face, you actually can watch the way that they react. And so if you say something hurtful, if you tell someone, hey, you're ugly, or I don't like what you're wearing, or you did a terrible job on this project, you can watch their face, and their face drops, they start frowning, their shoulders sag, and you read that body language, and it makes you feel empathy. It makes you feel bad for what you said, and so you don't want to say that again. And so what Dr. Turkle reminds us and tells us is that when you get behind your devices, you can't read body language. You can't see facial expressions. You have no idea how the person is going to react to whatever you write, whatever you type, whatever you tweet. And so what happens is when we say these things online, we actually walk away, and most of us pat ourselves on the back thinking that we just did something good in the world, when in reality, there's a good chance that you just hurt someone. And if you could have seen their face, you would have actually felt the empathy. And so here's what she says: you have to suppress your empathy in order to participate fully in the mobile revolution. You become a different person when you get behind a screen. And so in the course of this series, what I've tried to do is I've tried to give you a side effect, and then I've tried to answer two questions. One, what does the Bible have to say about that? And then two, are there things we can actually do to counter the side effect? And so for a moment, I want to turn to Scripture and see what does the Scriptures have to say about the way in which we use our words. The book of the Bible that has the most to say about the things that we say is the book of Proverbs. In fact, there's over 100 Proverbs which have something to say about what you say. Your tongue, your words, the language that you use. Proverbs talks a lot about what you say. And so if you have a Bible, I'm going to go all over the place in Proverbs, but I want to begin in Proverbs chapter 18. Proverbs 18 has a great one-liner, which in many ways kind of summarizes what the whole book has to say about the power of words. So Proverbs chapter 18, verse 21, Scripture says this: the tongue has the power of life, and the tongue has the power of death. Now that's a really strong statement about words, about language. Like if I didn't tell you that it was the tongue that has the power of life and death, you could probably come up with lots of other things that you would say, well, that has the power of death. Like when I think about, what are things that have the power of death? I think about like a gun or a bomb or capital punishment, like power of death. And yet the author here is saying that your words have that much power. When I think about things that have the power of life, I think about hospitals. I think about foster parents. I think about Jesus. I think about the resurrection. I think about nature. I think about the sun. I think about rain. And yet the author here is saying that the things that come out of your mouth, they have the power of life. And so the author goes on in the book of Proverbs to tell us just exactly how this happens. And in a minute, I'll read you some scriptures. But the main idea here that I want you to get is your words, they carry a lot of weight. Every word that comes out of your mouth, it does make a difference to someone, somewhere. And so our job is to weigh our words very carefully. So if you choose to bring gracious words to the world, that's going to have one effect. And if you choose to bring harsh words to the world, that's going to have a completely different effect. And Proverbs actually spells out what happens. So if you choose to bring harsh words to the world, here's what Proverbs says that will produce. Harsh words, they destroy neighbors. They pierce like swords. They stir up anger. And they crush spirits. There was a lady in my office just a few weeks ago. She's in her 50s, extremely successful, has a great job, and she's contemplating quitting her job to start a nonprofit. She's prayed about this for years. It's a big passion of hers. She feels called and compelled to do this. And the reason she came to visit with me is she's just feeling a little bit afraid about taking this big step. And so I talked with her for quite a while and tried to listen to what is it that's causing her to really not want to make this jump. And about 45 minutes into the conversation, I said, what do you think it really is? Why are you so scared? and she looked up at the ceiling and her eyes started welling up, and she said, when I was 8 years old, my mom looked at me and told me, "You will never be successful." And I've carried those words with me my whole life, and that's the reason I don't think I can make the jump. 42 years, the words stayed with her. So if you choose to bring harsh words to the world in which you live, it's going to have a disastrous effect. Now, the opposite is also true. Proverbs tells us what happens if you choose to bring gracious words to the world. So here's what happens according to Proverbs. Gracious words, they can cheer a heart. They can turn away wrath. They promote instruction. I love this one. They bring healing to the bones. Just one word, one phrase, there's something that you could say to somebody which can absolutely change their life. I remember 4 years ago when I became the preacher here, that was a time of great anxiety for me. I didn't think I was old enough. I didn't think I was wise enough. I didn't think I was experienced enough to take this job. And so I had a ton of fear about being the preacher here. And I remember one of the things my dad said to me. We went out one day and we were talking about this, and I was just being really honest with him, saying, "Dad, I thought maybe someday, but I just didn't think it would be this season of life to do this." And I'll never forget what my dad said to me. It was very simple, and yet for me, it's been a big blessing to me. He looked at me and he said, "My grandfather survived the Great Depression, and my dad survived World War II. So I think you can survive being a preacher." I was like, oh. That might not sound profound to you, but man, that was so helpful to me. It was words of life. He was just saying, hey, we're Brookmans. We do hard things. You can do this. Sermons, it's not as hard as dealing with Nazis. You can figure this out. And it was meaningful to me. Like, I held those words in my heart. They were life-giving. And so when I get discouraged, even today, I go back to that conversation. That one conversation was so important to my life because he chose to speak words of life to me. So if you're a man, studies show that you're going to say 13,000 words in a day. And if you're a woman, studies show that you're going to say 20,000 words in a day. So just as a side note, ladies, if you wonder why we struggle listening to you, it's because we have to endure an extra 7,000 words. It's just sometimes that's hard. So you've got between 13,000 and 20,000 words in a day that you're speaking. So my question is, what kind of a world do your words create? And even more specifically, what kind of a world do your digital words create? Like, if I could take all the emails and posts and everything you've done digitally for the last 2 or 3 months, what kind of a world would that create? Does it bring life to the world, or does it bring darkness? Because your words are not neutral. Your words carry weight. Now, some of you might be saying, okay, Phil, I get that. I know my words are powerful. I know they can create things or they can destroy things. But what I'm concerned about is, how do I get better at bringing life digitally? Proverbs actually has some really profound words to tell us how we can get better at offering life through our language. So I want to tell you my new favorite proverb. It's Proverbs chapter 30. Proverbs chapter 30, verse 32 is a really interesting line. And the author says these words: "If you play the fool and exalt yourself, or if you plan evil." Now, don't put the second half of the verse up there. Let's just pause and consider what this verse is saying. So if you exalt yourself or if you plan evil, how would you think that this particular proverb would end? I was at a Bible study this week, and I read the first half of this proverb, and I asked the group of people I was with, I asked them, how do you think that this proverb would end? And one girl raised her hand and she said, well, I think it would end something like this. If you exalt yourself or if you plan evil, then evil is going to come on you. And I said, well, that sounds like a pretty good ending. I can hear that in Scripture. And then a guy in the back row raised his hand and he said, I think it should end like this. If you plan evil and exalt yourself, then you should go to hell. I said, well, that's pretty extreme, but I guess you could end it that way. So here's how it ends. Here's how the line ends. If you play the fool and exalt yourself, or if you plan evil, clap your hand over your mouth. That's a fascinating line. So the proverb is not predictive, meaning like here's what's going to happen to you if you do these things. The proverb is prescriptive. In other words, here's what you should do if you think you're about to say something that you shouldn't. You should clap your hand over your mouth. In other words, what this proverb is teaching us is that on the one hand, words are powerful, yes, but what you should learn if you want to get better at speaking to people, and if you want to get better at bringing life to your digital world, here's one idea. Learn the power of a pause. Learn the power of a pause. That's what the passage is telling you. If you think you're about to do something, just wait. Just pause. And if you can pause just for 2 or 3 seconds and just think before you say something, then what's going to happen is the words that you actually speak, they're going to bring a lot more life into the world. Look at this proverb from Proverbs 17. It says something very similar. A man of knowledge uses words with, say this word with me, uses words with restraint. I mean, think about it. We're about to have the election here in a few days, next week. What would it be like if every single time you were about to have a conversation with someone about the election, or every time you were about to post something about the election, you read this proverb? A man of knowledge uses words with restraint. Learn the power of a pause. I want to go back to this proverb in chapter 30, because the proverb in chapter 30 addresses 2 areas in life where we need to get better at pausing. And so if you remember, the very first line of this proverb in chapter 30 says, if you play the fool and exalt yourself. So these are moments in which we need to learn how to pause. Now, back in Scripture times, I don't know exactly what they wrestled with when it came to exalting themselves. Maybe it was just people saying, my chariot is better than your chariot, or my tunic is nicer than your tunic. I don't know what they said, but I do know what it's like today. What it's like today, it's those moments when you're in conversation and you really want to name drop to make someone else think that you're important. Or it's those times where you want to post something online that's going to make you look pretty cool. Those are moments when today we have this need or this yearning to exalt ourselves. A few years ago, Jeff McMillan introduced us to a word. It's been in our vernacular for almost a decade now, but I always remember the sermon that Jeff McMillan preached. He introduced us to this idea of humble bragging. And you might have forgot what that means, so I will reintroduce you to this idea. A humble brag is a seemingly self-deprecating statement which is really meant to make other people think that you are awesome. And we do it all the time. Here's a few examples of some humble brags. This guy named Tote McGoats, he tweeted this: I just realized I've only showered in one of my 5 showers since moving here. This must change. Okay, really? Like, what are you really trying to say here? I mean, he's just trying to help us understand he's got a great house and he wants to brag about it. Here's someone that I actually really enjoy listening to him with. He's a sports analyst, Colin Coward. He used to work for ESPN, now he's with Fox Sports, and he said, 9 hours in a room with 7 comedy writers yesterday for a CBS sitcom about my life. Lots of talented, funny people in this world who never get props. Okay, what he's wanting us to think is, let's lift up these poor writers that aren't famous and never get props. But what's he really trying to say with this? I mean, he's really trying to say that my life is so interesting that people are writing a TV show about it. And that's a humble brag. It's a seemingly self-deprecating statement, but it's really meant to make other people think that you're great. Here's one from a 16-year-old Canadian. He wrote this to Jimmy Kimmel. He said, hey, I'm 16. I'm publishing 3 books and an album this year. Do you have any advice on how to handle it best? I mean, what are you talking about? What 16-year-old really writes that stuff? All he's wanting us to think is, he must be really important because he's publishing books. So those are examples of humble brags. And if you read Proverbs, what the writer would urge you to do is the next time you have the urge to do this, whether it's face-to-face with somebody or whether it's online, again, learn the power of a pause. So the next time that you're going to tell a story that's going to make you look amazing, Next time you're going to post a picture that you hope everybody thinks that you're just the greatest person in the world, learn the power of a pause. Exalting yourself is not the way of the Lord. Now, here's the second line in that verse. If you plan evil. And remember here, this verse is in the context of language. So he's not meaning like big evil scheme like a Timothy McVeigh putting a bomb in the back of a truck and driving it to Oklahoma City. He's meaning when you plan evil conversationally. So when you have a thought like, I want to say this to this person, I can't wait to say it because it's going to make them feel terrible, that's another place in which we need to get better at pausing. If you plan evil, learn the power of a pause. So let's practice this for just a minute, just in your own mind. I want you to think of the person that you're most angry at right now. Put that person's face in front of your mind. Now I want you to imagine what you really want to say to that person. What do you really want to say to put them in their place? Third thing I want you to think about is one simple question. Is that the wisest thing to say? Not is that the most persuasive thing to say, or is that the right thing, like as in the correct thing to say, but is it the wisest thing to say? See, if you can learn the power of a pause, that's always the question you should ask yourself. You should ask, Lord, is this the wisest thing that I should say in this moment? If I say these words, is it really going to bring light to the world, or is it going to bring darkness to the world? And if you can learn the power of a pause, I promise you, the world around you will get quite a bit brighter. And if you don't learn the power of a pause, the reality is you could cause irreparable damage to somebody else because of the words that you say. And I will say this is especially true when it comes to family. The closer you are to somebody, the more your words can hurt them. And so sometimes when it comes to our siblings and our parents and our sons and our daughters, we think that because we're close to them that we have more license to speak more freely. But the opposite is actually true. Your words hurt those people more than any other people in the world. And so if you're going to learn the power of a pause, start at home. Because if you can learn the power of a pause at home, then your home, it's going to become a much brighter place. Words carry weight. Learn the power of a pause. And when you put these two ideas together, something great happens. Proverbs 15:23. A person finds joy in giving an apt reply. How good is a timely word? You see, it's not just what you say, it is when you say it. And if you learn to combine the power of words with the power of pauses, then you really will have the potential to change somebody else's life. That's what happened to a guy named Emerlo Fiorentino. So this is a guy who passed away a few years ago. The New York Times wrote an article about him. When he was 17 years old, he had a dream of becoming a lighting designer, meaning the people that design lights for big shows, big productions, that's what he wanted to do. He was brilliant. He was the top of his class. Everybody was excited about him carrying out his dream. So when he was 17 years old, he was walking around his neighborhood and he found this empty shell casing, like a cartridge. And he thought it looked interesting, and so he took it into his garage because he wanted to make it into a keychain. So he got a welder out, and he started welding it, trying to make it into a keychain. Well, the only problem was he was mistaken. It was actually live ammunition. And so 17-year-old kid blows up, this cartridge blows up in his garage, and it really disfigures most of one side of his face. So they rush him to the hospital, and they're doing this emergency surgery on him. Well, he ends up losing his right eye, and so they have to put a fake eye in, and then the whole side of his face is just completely disfigured. Well, people start to come and visit him. And what he says about this experience in his life is that most people that visited him, they didn't really know what to say. And so they ended up saying things that caused more harm than good. So they would say things like, well, maybe you can find another career route, or it's okay, it's not that bad. But he would look at their faces, and their whole countenance would sink, and he could just tell how revolting he was to them. And so he started to get lower and lower and lower emotionally as he sat in that hospital room. Well, then one of his high school teachers walked in one day. Walked in, smile on his face. He paused. He thought about what he was going to say. And then here's what he said to him. He said, "I think you're going to be the best one-eyed lighting designer that the world has ever seen." So he heard those words when he was 17 years old. Those words absolutely changed his life. He thought, you know what, I still can be a lighting designer. So what he did is he went on to truly be the best lighting designer the world has ever seen. He's done lighting shows for Disney World. He's done lighting shows for Frank Sinatra. He did the lighting shows for presidents, for 8 different presidents. He developed the first photos from space in the 1960s. And so think about this man. Think about how different his life would have been if that high school teacher hadn't learned the power of a pause and then learned how much weight his words carried. His life would have absolutely been different. So each week I've given you a little bit of homework if you've wanted to try to engage me on this digital series. So here's your homework if you want to do something this week. I want you to think about one person in your life that you could uniquely bless through your words. There is somebody that you know, that I don't know, that probably nobody else in the room knows, that you could uniquely bless through the power of your words. Who is that person? In fact, for just a moment, I want you to think about that question. So kind of take a deep breath. Ask yourself this question: Lord, if I was to bless somebody this week, who would it be? And just pause. Who's the first person that comes to your mind? So this week, your homework is bless that person through your words. Learn the power of a pause, and then use your words to bring light to the world. You know, the most powerful words you'll ever say are very simple. Jesus is Lord. If you've been with this church for a while, you'll know that before we baptize people, they come down front and we ask them a very important question. We ask them if they believe in Jesus. The reason we ask them that is because in the book of Romans in chapter 10, Scripture tells us that when we confess to people, Jesus is Lord, and we believe in our heart that He was risen from the dead, that is part of the thing that saves us. And so that's why we confess Jesus is Lord before we're baptized. And so if that's something you've never done, then I want you to come tell me about that when we sing this next song. It'll be the best thing you ever say. Jesus is Lord. In first service, during the invitation, we had someone come forward, and she was the victim of someone else's really harsh words. Her boss told her something on Friday that absolutely ruined her weekend, and she's not sure how to handle it. That could be somebody else in this room. Maybe somebody else's words have really hurt you. Let the church pray for you. If there's any way that we can bless you today, I'd encourage you to come tell me about it while we stand and while we sing.